Okay. Hi, my name is Kassy Jew, and for my research, and for my project, I did a research paper on how have wars in the past affected food security in Vietnam today. I I always felt a strong connection with food. I am both Chinese and Vietnamese, and food has always been this kind of gateway to getting closer with my heritage. I learned about food security in the past in my freshman year health class, and this idea of food security has always been on my mind, even in present day as a junior in high school. And so some key topics that I basically covered in my research paper was the background, the history of wars, COVID-19, food security, food modernization, and some solutions. For a little bit of background, food insecurity is defined as the condition of not having access to sufficient food or food of an adequate quality to meet one's basic needs. And this is defined by the Oxford Dictionary. Oh, sorry, skipped a slide. And so I learned that Vietnam's food insecurity is labeled as moderate. It has a score of 11.9 on the Global Hunger Index and is ranked 54th out of 125 countries regarding hunger. So I essentially thought that the food security issue in Vietnam was a lot more dire than it actually is. So some particular wars that I discussed or I've researched was the Vietnam famine of 1945, the Vietnam War in 1955, and the 2005-2008 global food crisis. The Vietnam famine, so for the Vietnam famine in 1945, this was when Japan and Vietnam had underwent a dual colonization between Japan and France. During this time, Japan and France implemented regulations such as the Rice Accords. The Rice Accords basically called for Vietnam to export a huge ton of rice. This was a problem because there's so much rice being exported from the country that it left the people living in Vietnam being depleted of their grain. This regulation, along with other regulations, plus natural disasters, led to a famine lasting from 1944 to 1945. And I chose, even though this particular topic doesn't really relate back to present day food security in particularly, I chose to focus on this war because it relates to the growth that Vietnam has. Because as you can see probably in the dialogue that I have, present day, Vietnam is the second largest exporter of rice globally, which means that Vietnam has come a long way from being completely depleted the grain to being a big powerhouse in rice. So as this war, we all probably know, is the Vietnam War of 1955. It was a war between communists north of Vietnam and the south of Vietnam who want to escape communism. This war directly impacts modern day food insecurity in the country as two strategies were implemented during this time. These two strategies were the use of deadly herbicides, which include Agent Orange, Agent White, Agent Blue, and a couple other herbicides named after their canisters. These herbicides, they essentially were used to get rid of foliage on the ground. The problem is that they were excessively used to the point that the chemicals had become deeply embedded in the soil, which meant that the soil became infertile for any crops to be planted in it. And some parts of the soil is still embedded with the chemicals today. A second strategy that was used during this war was the use of landmines. As we all know, landmines were used to basically blow up land, destroy the land. And today in modern Vietnam, there's a lot of landmines still scattered around the ground that they have not found yet. So a lot of farmers, especially in the northern and southern border of Vietnam, when the war was at its large, a lot of farmers had to completely abandon their crop fields and abandon their rice paddies because they didn't want to step on a landmine that hadn't exploded yet. And this is This was a very valid fear because this exact situation had happened before in the past. Now, the 2005-2008 global food crisis. This was more of a global crisis rather than a war, but I personally thought this as a global war, technically. During this time, food prices skyrocketed and caused a global panic, leading to a worldwide crisis regarding food supply. This led to a rice inflation in the country of Vietnam. This rice inflation eventually led to a ban on rice. In general, Vietnam closed off its borders for rice. Well, it closed off its borders for rice exportations overseas, so other countries could not gain the grain, basically. And this was a problem because other countries were unable. This was a problem because as Vietnam is the second biggest country to export rice, a lot of other countries weren't able to get a lot of rice at this time. Now, there was also COVID-19 effects. I also define COVID-19 as a global war. And during this time, there is a concern for financial accessibility of food. This included market panic, poverty, and online shopping. For market panic, supermarkets were completely stripped away of food and other resources as people hoarded them because there is a panic that there weren't going to be enough supplies for everyone to have. This eventually led to food prices also being greatly increased, which wasn't great because poverty rates also increased during this time, and the poverty rates meant that people couldn't buy food at this time. However, there was a benefit, especially in the corporate field, which includes the use of online shopping. Online shopping greatly increased during this time as this was the only source of way that people were able to buy goods and groceries and other resources. In fact, a survey by the Business Association of High Quality Vietnamese Goods found that 98% of citizens who dealt with buying goods online during this period of time stated that they will continue to do so in the future. So this was very good for the corporate world again, as they were able to gain a lot more customer base. Now, in present day, there have been improvements through regulations to basically ensure food security in the country. This includes rice security and the idea of food modernization. With the idea of food security basically means rice security. As I said before, Vietnam is the second largest exporter of rice, which essentially means that there have been a lot of regulations to ensure that rice security is great in the country, basically. Rice accounts for 90% of domestic food production and takes up 78% of agricultural cropland. And because of this has led to regulations involving preservation of land, rice exportation regulations, and also rice paddy farmer regulations. With the last part for rice paddy farmers, the farmers have a lot of benefits that the government has provided them in order to ensure that the grain of rice, that the rice supply is both in adequate quality and in large quantity as well. There's also the idea of food modernization in the country. In order to further ensure food security, the Vietnam government implemented an initiative to modernize the food system in the country in 1986 specifically. This directly involved with the use of replacing traditional markets with supermarkets. This idea both have pros and cons, as the supermarkets were more efficient and also improved trade between foreign countries as supermarkets provided better access to foreign goods. But it also had a lot of cons, as since supermarkets replaced traditional markets, they have factors such as they deplete the culture, as many of the traditional markets were around for a long time, but supermarkets basically took over them and diminish their whole cultural value since they weren't there anymore. The supermarkets also took away jobs as the people working in traditional markets previously were out of business. And the supermarkets also catered different palettes of foods and were more expensive. With the idea of catering different palettes of food, it's a good and bad thing as people were able to expand their palette, their basic palette of food. But for the older generation in particular for Vietnam, they had a harder time adjusting to this change. And then some solutions that kind of tie into the regulations of food security that have been implemented are the Doi Moi reform policies and the food outreach programs. The Doi Moi policies were implemented in 1986, which sought to transition Vietnam from a command economy to a social-oriented market economy. This policy in particular really helped push Vietnam to become the second biggest exporter of rice in the world, and basically help Vietnam get back on its feet after the aftermath of the Vietnam War. There have also been food outreach programs that exist today that you all could also look into if you want. And these food outreach programs basically provide aid in food insecurity and hunger in Vietnam. An example of a program is in the International Volunteer HQ. Through the International Volunteer HQ, you can volunteer in places such as Ho Chi Minh City in particular, and basically volunteer and help with the food security in Vietnam by doing volunteer work and helping with those who don't have the money to buy food greatly. So in conclusion, when doing this paper, I was mostly focusing on how wars in the past might affect food security today. But as I got deeper into my project, it shifted from that point of view to more of food insecurity, how Vietnam has grown in food insecurity throughout the years in war. Vietnam has a food security issue of moderate, which means is not as severe as I once thought, but that does not mean that Vietnam does not have an issue in food security in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kassy. One quick question for you. So let me actually go ahead and chat. So somebody asked, in general, has there been a change in the Vietnamese diet since the food crisis? And what are some of the foods that have become more popular?
There definitely has been a change in the food crisis in general, as the years have gone on and the Western countries have become a bigger impact towards Vietnam, have basically rubbed off on Vietnam. A lot of Westernized foods have entered the palate of many Vietnamese citizens. As for particular foods, I don't have many off the top of my head, but I do know that classic American food, you could say, such as cheeseburgers and pizzas, have become more popular in Vietnam since the food crisis, as Western influences have become stronger since then.
Amazing. Well, thank you again so much, Kassy.